When it comes to these two national monuments in Utah, Grand Staircase-Escalante and Bears Ears, there's been this pattern of changing course. It's been described as a pendulum, as a policy swing, as a cycle of designation and reduction and then restoration and then reduction again. And for those who live in the area around these places, whiplash is the word. The monuments were created by President Clinton and President Obama. In his first term, President Trump cut them way back. President Biden restored the protected areas, and then just last month, Trump said he was shrinking them again, only this time by even more. And beneath all of this back and forth is a long-running debate about the Antiquities Act. It's a law that was created to allow presidents to protect these places of historic and scientific importance. But critics say Democratic presidents have stretched the law to cover vast areas of public land and remove millions of acres from other possible uses. Utah Governor Cox said President Trump had right-sized the monuments. But the public land advocate Kate Groetzinger told us this week the story of the Antiquities Act is actually more complicated than that. And what's interesting is the story of this law begins in the very place where its meaning is being debated today. Groetzinger says it begins with a man named Edgar Lee Hewitt.
Edgar Lee Hewitt was an early archaeologist and really one of the first people to explore and map the archaeology of the Southwest. Chaco Canyon, Mesa Verde, and what is now Bears Ears. He is noticing that many of them have been looted. You know, the pots are gone, the metates, anything of value has been sort of swept from a number of these sites by ostensibly early homesteaders. And then he gets to Chaco Canyon and he finds this family, the Wetherill family, and he finds that they've moved into Chaco Canyon. They're using sort of like the structures there, the old stone walls, as pens for their cattle. And he understandably gets really upset. So he makes these maps and he takes them to Congress and he says, we need to do something. And he finds a sympathetic ear in a congressman from Iowa who champions this Antiquities Act that Hewitt has drafted to allow the president to move unilaterally to protect these sites. To get protection for any of these sites, prior to this, Congress has to pass a standalone bill. So Hewitt presents Congress with this solution that says presidents can create monuments that protect objects of scientific or cultural interest, and they can be sort of whatever size the president determines they should be. And interestingly, a congressman from New Mexico steps in and says, absolutely not. We need a size limit on this. And Edgar Lee Hewitt says, no, that won't work. And it turns out Congress sides with him. They pass the bill, and Teddy Roosevelt immediately starts using it. So in 1907, he designates Chaco Canyon. He kicks the Wetherills out. He designates Mount Olympus National Monument, and he also uses it to designate the Grand Canyon as a national monument. So this is sort of the beginning of our modern conception of national monuments. Fast forward roughly 100 years.
I'm about to sign a proclamation that will establish the Grand Staircase-Escalante National Monument.
This act is used by Bill Clinton and Obama to protect Grand Staircase and Bears Ears.
And it's our responsibility to protect these treasures for future generations, just as previous generations protected them for us.
Now we have these two monuments here in Utah that have become almost political footballs, being shrunk, being restored, being now shrunk again. And at the heart of this fight is the question of whether these monuments are too big. Utah's delegation, Spencer Cox, Mike Lee, they love to argue that the Antiquities Act, is being abused, that Congress never intended monuments to be this big, when in fact, when you look at the legal history and the legislative history, Edgar Lee Hewitt originally said no acreage cap. Congress passed the law without an acreage cap. The courts have upheld that. So this argument by Utah that they're just sort of trying to fix a mistake or sort of rein in the president from like abusing his power. It's not true. It doesn't ring true when you sort of bring up the evidence and the history. It's really actually quite misleading and it's disingenuous. And in fact, the lack of size limit has worked to make the act stand the test of time. Science has come a long way since 1906. So presidents can still use it and sort of adjust it to reflect modern science, which, views this as a connected landscape, not as a bunch of individual piles of rock. Like, the lack of size limit in the act is a feature, not a bug. It makes the Antiquities Act like the U.S. Constitution. It makes it a document that can adjust and adapt to modern conditions. And putting a size limit in there, that would be really, really silly because it would sort of undercut the Act's ability to adjust to modern science and our modern understanding of the world.
That's Kate Groetzinger. She's the communications director for the Center for Western Priorities. It's a public lands advocacy group. This is Radio West. I'm Doug Fabrizio. Today in the program, we're looking at the latest turn in this story of the two national monuments in Utah, what the real impacts are for the people who live there, and we'll also explore what's motivating the president. Is this about energy development or just politics? Later, we'll take a deeper look at the history of the Antiquities Act, what it reveals about this power presidents have used for more than a century, and what it still doesn't tell us about what happens next. So let's begin with David Condos. He's KUER Southern Utah reporter. He told us the thing that jumps out right away is just how much land President Trump has cut.
The reductions are obviously very, very large when you're talking about around 90%. And these are very large pieces of land to begin with. Even, comparing it to the previous reductions from several years ago, these are larger. In the case of Grand Staircase, much larger. And so, very significant, but not necessarily surprising. I mean, I did a story before the 2024 presidential election about this exact possibility because people were already, thinking, hey, this has already swung a couple times. It could swing again. So not necessarily a surprise that this happened. But I think, especially for conservationists I talked to and tribal advocates that I talked to, I think the scope of the reductions was striking, even though they maybe expected it was coming.
I mean, one of my questions was, what's left?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, not a whole lot. If you're looking at, obviously, the total amount of acres. With Grand Staircase, there's one somewhat larger chunk kind of around the towns of Boulder and Escalante, and then a couple very small ones down in the kind of central and southern part of the park. And then with Bears Ears, still somewhat similar to what was done several years ago. But yeah, one small unit in the north, one slightly larger unit in the south, and then a couple of very specific tiny units for specific sites, archaeological, historical sites. Very, very different. And so, and obviously that means there's a lot of stuff that was in these monuments that is no longer in the monuments because it's just around 10% of it left.
Let's talk about how the president and Utah leaders are kind of framing all of this. They're saying that the president said it's a win for local control. As far as you can tell, what does he mean by that?
Yeah, so that's something I've heard from Utah leaders. It's something that Utah state leaders have said for a long time, is this idea of federal overreach, right? That, hey, Utah, so much of it is federal land, and that means that it is essentially out of Utah's control, out of local communities' control, because the regulations are set elsewhere. And so, for some of the local leaders that I've talked to, they're concerned that, hey, that means that land is essentially locked up, is like the phrase that they might use, that there could be potential within those lands for some kind of economic activity, some kind of logging, mining, something along those lines that is now not possible. And for areas that have a majority of their land in federal land, that is something that at least local leaders have expressed concerns about.
But does shrinking a national monument actually give locals, give Utah more control over these lands, or are they still managed by the federal government under different rules?
Yeah, and that's a good point. These lands are still federal lands. The proclamations did not change that. So the Bureau of Land Management still, is in charge of these lands, but the rules are different. So like if you think about, a lot of BLM land or national forest land elsewhere in Utah and the West, there is some of that economic activity. There is logging or mining or exploration for those things. But monuments have some special protections. And so even though it is still federal land, I think the idea from Utah leaders is that, hey, this will give more flexibility for local communities to explore some of these economic possibilities.
Help us make sense of what the Governor Cox said in the Oval Office that day. He said that shrinking the monument had this practical effect of making it easier to manage. This is what he called. He said it's right-sizing the monuments. So it's going to make it easier to manage this smallest area possible to protect the antiquities. I couldn't figure out what that meant. Do you understand what he meant?
I don't know if I know for sure what he meant. I mean, like I was saying, the previous boundaries for these monuments was very, very large. Yeah. And so, as an aside, the budgets for the National Park Service and federal lands are also very small. Even at much more visited parks like Zion, they haven't kept up with the rise in visitors coming there and doing activities on the land. And so, I mean, I think you could say with land that is very, very vast, if you don't have that many employees checking on what people are doing, there could be more opportunity for people to be breaking rules or whatever the case. But yeah, I'm not sure exactly what he was thinking.
Well, I just, the thing that was, I suppose, confusing to me anyway, was that, is he concerned about the federal government being able to manage it? Because it's not like the state is managing. It's not the state's resources that are being implicated here, right?
Yeah, this could just be another argument for, hey, the federal government is coming in and setting aside these very large pieces of land, and you could make the argument that perhaps he's making there that, hey, and they're also not doing the job that we would like them to do with that management.
So, David, explain to us the difference between what the president did this time compared to when he shrunk it last time in 2017, because he made it even more small this time. In 2017, he cut the Grand Staircase by half and Bears Ears by just more than 80%. This time, it's a lot more than that. So help us understand the difference, and can you help us understand why he cut so much more this time?
Yeah, the difference is huge, especially if you're looking at the maps of Grand Staircase. If you compare the 2017 cuts to the cuts that just happened, there is a huge, huge section kind of in the central part of Grand Staircase that was still part of the monument after the previous proclamations during Trump's first term. And now almost all of it is not. And that's some of the areas that people go to. There's, a lot of, potential hikes that people could do in those areas. And again, like, it doesn't mean that those hikes magically disappear. It's still federal land. I could go get in my car and drive and go do some of those hikes. But yeah, it's drastically different. And so there is still what they're calling the canyons of the Escalante unit, which is up near the towns of Escalante and Boulder. And then there's a couple very small units in the central and southern part of the monument that remain. But it's, I mean, if you've ever seen a map of Grand Staircase, it's this, very large kind of blob that's covering, a lot of south central Utah. And now it's just, one small blob near Escalante and Boulder, and then two very small things. And then with Bears Ears, it is more similar, since the cuts from Trump's first term were quite large as well. The main difference there, or the main differences that I've seen, is the Indian Creek unit, which is the northern unit up kind of west of the town of Monticello, is much, much smaller than it was last time. And then there's a couple of very tiny units that are kind of for specific kind of prehistoric sites that are still carved out this time in the kind of central and southern part of the monument as well. I'm not sure if I can get in the president's head and know why. I mean, I guess the idea is that, hey, if someone thinks that they can cut 50% of a monument this way, then what's to stop them from cutting 90% of a monument this way? If the argument is that the president has the power to do this, then you I guess because you can. But I'm guessing that he's learning a lot of what he knows about these monuments from Utah leaders. And so it's perhaps the case that some Utah politicians were pushing for these larger cuts this time.
And I think it raises this larger question about how much of this is just ideological that you're hearing from, conservatives around here. And you've heard the same message for a long time. This is federal overreach. They're locking up the land. They're not granting the right kind of access to people. It's not multiple use in the way they want it. So how much of it is that ideological? And how much of this is practical? Because it seems to be there is some practicality motivating the president. In your reporting, you mentioned, for example, last year, President Trump issued this national energy emergency, which meant, speeding up the development of, energy and mineral leases on federal land. So talk a little bit about there's the ideology, but then there's the practical. Like the president wants access to minerals, so there's an energy motive here as well.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair, but I think you could also say that the energy motivation is also ideological, because there's other ways to produce energy that besides coal or use some of the things that they've mentioned, mining there. But yeah, I think I would say ideology seems like a big part of it. Obviously, when you're seeing these massive swings back and forth as the last couple administrations have come in, the Biden administration restored both of these monuments and then now these recent cuts. And that kind of ping-ponging back and forth is something that I would say both sides are not necessarily happy about, or both sides of people like on the ground are not happy about, because it creates a lot of uncertainty. But I think if you're a politician, you can come in and create this, massive change that creates headlines, and you can frame that as a win for your team. Then, yeah, I think it would be fair to say there is ideological reasons that you would want to do that and say, hey, look at this thing that I did because you voted for me.
So I want to go back to January of 2025, and in the last days of the Biden administration, President Biden approves this management plan for Bears Ears. And this was this collaboration between federal land managers and the 5 tribes of the Bears Ears Commission. And they'd been working on this thing for, a number of years. But the president approves it, honestly, just days before he leaves office. So what happens to that arrangement with Trump's new proclamation?
Well, as far as I've heard is that because the boundaries were changed and changed so drastically that there will need to be a new management plan for this new iteration of both monuments. And so essentially my understanding is that work is erased. And that's obviously something that people who worked on that, the tribal advocates, conservation groups, people who have been kind of invested in seeing that previous management plan happen. That's something they are very upset about. And I think the other thing, obviously, with the tribal element is that with both monuments, but with Bears Ears especially, there was a very kind of a first of its kind integration of, hey, the tribes are going to be very involved in the management and how this monument is set up. And that has been erased. So you mentioned the Bears Ears Commission. That was specifically terminated by the president's proclamation regarding Bears Ears. And so from the folks that I talked with, that is something that is, on a philosophical sense, something that has been very hurtful or very devastating, is that, hey, not only was there all this practical hours and hours of work that went into these previous plans, but it's also just having a couple sentences that erases that commission in the proclamation, I think also just kind of sends a signal that, hey, the administration thinks those voices don't matter, that work that has been done over the past several years doesn't matter. And yeah, I think that's been very hurtful for the tribal groups that have been involved.
Let me ask you finally your sense of, I just want to get a sense of you now having just what you're hearing on the ground about all of this. So you hear from the president in the Oval Office saying that this was desperately needed, that the people there felt a sense of unfairness because of it. And I just wondered if you sensed that people felt aggrieved by these monuments, or if they thought about it at all. I mean, like, what's the sense of it on the ground as far as you can tell?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously there were big protests after Trump's actions. So there has been some kind of groundswell of opposition, which there had been for previous similar actions in the past as well. So that was expected. I mean, I'm not sure how much people, living around here think about this in their day to day. I mean, certainly I think this draws big headlines from national media. It draws input from national conservation groups and national advocacy groups that are pushing for less regulation, less federal overreach. But as far as the people on the ground, I'm not sure how many people were feeling aggrieved by the monuments. That's not something that I have heard frequently from residents around here. It is something I've heard a lot from elected officials. But yeah, I think from my sense is that most of the people who spend their time thinking about these monuments are the people who actually just go out and use them and go hiking and camping or whatever they do. Or if they're, a rancher, maybe they take their cattle grazing on them. And so I'm not sure how much of it is kind of on people's minds day to day, other than the folks that are actually out there using it on a regular basis.
David Condos, thank you very much.
Thank you.
David Condos. He's KUER's Southern Utah reporter. You can find links to his coverage on our website, RadioWest.org. We'll take a break. Come back in a moment. You're listening to Radio West. This is Radio West. I'm Doug Fabrizio. Today in the program, we've been talking about President Trump's decision to once again shrink Bears Ears and Grand Staircase-Escalante national monuments. This is the latest twist in a years-long cycle of creating, then shrinking, then restoring, then shrinking these spaces. So we've been looking at what this back and forth means for the lands themselves and the people who live nearby. But let's come back to the Antiquities Act itself. Because the president and other state leaders who were with him in the Oval Office last month said shrinking the monuments was actually right-sizing them. But is that accurate? Kate Groetzinger says it isn't. We heard from Groetzinger at the beginning of the show. She's the communications director for the Center for Western Priorities. It's a conservation organization based in Denver. I thought we'd start with your thesis and then we'll sort of go in and break it down. So the Trump administration and Utah leaders, they are saying shrinking Bears Ears and Grand Staircase is about the way they're talking about it is this is about returning the Antiquities Act to what they think Congress had intended. And they point to this one phrase in the law, and it says this. It says the president may reserve parcels of land, and here's the crux of it, the limits of which in all cases shall be confined to the smallest area compatible with proper care and management of the objects to be protected. And that's the argument that they were making in the Oval Office, that we need to, as the Governor Cox said, right-size this. But you're arguing this leaves out more than a century of history, a history in which presidents have actually used the act to protect really big landscapes. So talk about your thesis here and the idea that you're getting at in your writing.
Yeah, so Utah's delegation is saying that these monuments are simply too big. Congress never intended the president to be able to do this, and that's why they need to be shrunk, because they're protecting things that shouldn't be eligible, I guess, under the Antiquities Act. And really, their argument immediately runs into trouble because the Antiquities Act was written very vaguely. The language you just quoted from the Act, the smallest area compatible to protect the objects of scientific and cultural or historical interest, that language is pretty subjective. And without getting too into the weeds here, Teddy Roosevelt, who, was one of our greatest conservation presidents and really founded the conservation movement in the U.S., he was the one who signed the Antiquities Act into law in 1906. It was passed by Congress, but supported by Roosevelt, and he immediately got to work using it. He designated a couple of small monuments. He used it in, I believe, 1908 to protect the Grand Canyon, and that was around 800,000 acre monument. That's a landscape scale monument, which, Kate McGregor, Deputy Interior Secretary, stood in the Oval Office last month and said was not the intention of Congress when they passed this act. But I think it's really clear, if you're sort of a textualist or an originalist, it's really clear that Congress did not intend for there to be a acreage limit.
Well, we also need to talk about the fact that the Supreme Court weighed in very early on as well, because a mining company challenged the decision of the Grand Canyon National Monument of 800,000 acres. Tell us a little bit about that, because this case gets to the Supreme Court.
Yeah. So this was actually just one miner, just a guy named Ralph Cameron who staked.
Oh, it wasn't a company. It was a guy.
No, it was just one guy. He just staked it. This is, way back in the day when one guy could still go out and stake a claim. But he staked a claim inside Grand Canyon Monument's boundary, which, of course, I should mention, has been since turned into a national park by Congress. The power to create a national monument is still reserved to Congress, but a lot of our current parks were monuments, including Grand Canyon. So this guy staked the claim inside of Grand Canyon Monument, claiming that Roosevelt's monument proclamation was invalid. And it did make it up to the Supreme Court, which ruled unanimously that the monument was undoubtedly an object of unusual scientific interest and that it was fully within the scope of the Antiquities Act to be protected, including at the size that it was designated at. The Supreme Court ruled on that in, I believe, 1920. So this is kind of a question that's already been asked and answered. The answer was pretty unequivocal. So in Utah kind of just refuses to accept the facts as they are. And I think there's something very Utah about it to sort of keep pushing the issue until they get the answer they want.
Let's put a pin in this question of whether there's a Supreme Court precedent and how it might be respected or regarded by a current Supreme Court. Let's put a pin in that and come back to that in a minute. And let's talk a little bit, let's move forward to modern Utah and the monument that really ignited, I think, this fight. I think it's fair to say Grand Staircase-Escalante National Monument, when it was proclaimed by President Clinton in 1996, that seemed to trigger this kind of political, emotional reaction that's still being sort of, I think, thought about today, don't you think?
Absolutely, yeah. And, the conservation movement has changed a lot since that monument was created. It was created, you could say, sort of in back rooms in D.C. And the short history of the Grand Staircase designation is that Bill Clinton and his Interior Secretary, Bruce Babbitt, who is a sort of notable conservationist.
From Arizona.
They decided, from Arizona, they decided that this area needed to be protected. And specifically, they were responding to the threat of coal mining on the Kaiparowitz Plateau. Right. There was a mining company that had plans to mine coal on the Kaiparowitz Plateau. There's an open question of whether they actually would have been able to finance their project. It's a very remote region. There's really no roads out there, and it would have been a huge financial undertaking to get this coal out of the ground, even at the time. And that was, when coal was still profitable. And Bill Clinton and Bruce Babbitt decided they did not want this area to be mined. It was too, geologically significant and sort of ecologically significant to be sacrificed to the coal mining industry. And they designated Grand Staircase, and the details around how that was done are that the Utah delegation did not find out about it until it was reported in the newspaper. And Bill Clinton sat on the edge of the Grand Canyon in Arizona when he signed this proclamation. I've heard that was because he thought it would be a better photo op. As we know, Clinton was somewhat vain and cared about his public image, as most presidents do. And I think he's
but he
not
just
from
pissed
the West.
a lot of local leaders.
Yeah, it really upset locals. They were like, "You're not even going to come to our state to screw us over. You're going to do it from somewhere else. Are you?" And part of it may have been that he knew there was going to be backlash and didn't want to be in Utah when he did it. That's another theory I've heard. They thought that maybe there would be less, that it would cause less of a stir if he did it from the Grand Canyon, which of course was not true, and it backfired monumentally. And it continues to be brought up every time Grand Staircase is discussed, that it was really sort of a backroom deal worked out in the White House and just sort of imposed upon the people of Utah. And I think that's a pretty fair assessment of how that monument came about. Am I happy that it exists and that whole part of our state is not torn up by the mining industry and just sort of destroyed? When you mine for coal, it destroys the landscape forever. There's no bringing the landscape back from coal mining. And I think we can, many Utahns can agree that we're glad that Grand Staircase was protected. I think the way it was done was really set our conservation movement back by a lot.
Well, it gets us to, again, as you said, the state challenging in court the nature of the Antiquities Act, saying that it gives presidents too much power. So the state does that. They challenge the monument in court. In 2004, a federal judge rejects the argument, says the president has broad discretion under the law. So they're, again, asked and answered in federal court. Yes, exactly. And there are at least 3 or 4 other cases similar to this case where the question of how big a monument should be has been brought in front of various federal courts, and they've all ruled in favor of giving the president broad discretion. Where does Bears Ears fit in all of this? If the Grand Staircase-Escalante monument, triggers this sense of outrage, where is Bears Ears in all of that? It was different. The motive for that was this relationship with tribal nations. That was what inspired much of the designation here. So where does this fit in the story? Yeah. So I think it's kind of a perfect segue from Grand Staircase, which was, was the idea of a couple of dudes in Washington, D.C. Bears Ears is really different. My understanding after living in Bluff and having talked to some advocates who worked on Bears Ears from the very beginning, at the very beginning, it was actually proposed to be a mineral withdrawal. And for various reasons, they were trying to get it protected from extractive industry through Congress. And that failed because of a sort of agreement that fell apart. And at that point, the folks who were working to originally protect it sort of had contacted the tribes, is my understanding, and said, hey, you guys, this is your sort of ancestral land. People are going out and looting it, which was very well known. There was a big FBI raid in Blanding, Utah in the 90s over black market looting that was being, perpetrated on these cultural sites by folks in southern Utah. White folks, that is. And so the advocates sort of contacted the tribes and said, hey, we think that this area needs to be protected. Do you think so too? And if so, do you want to work together on this? And that was the beginning of a partnership that eventually coalesced into this really historic tribal coalition with 5 tribes that historically have not worked together and in fact were pitted against each other by early settlers. Many people might know this history, but early Mormon settlers would hire Mountain Ute folks to drive Navajo folks off of the land, and they would sort of hire these Native Americans as mercenaries to fight other Native tribes. So and of course, before the settlers showed up, these tribes were fighting each other all the time. And so it was really
historic for them to come together and work on a coalition together to ask for protections for this landscape that includes ancestral and like sacred sites for Puebloan people, for Navajo people, and for Ute people. There were various ideas about how to protect this landscape. What emerged ended up being a monument. And I do think Congress, can be very provincial, and if one member of Congress doesn't want a monument, they can block it in some cases. And so the Antiquities Act, thankfully exists to overcome the sort of petty whims of one senator or representative from Utah. And Obama, his administration, wrote a very, very long and detailed and well-studied proclamation explaining the size of the monument and why it was so big. And the reason it's so big is because it's a cultural landscape. When archaeologists study the sites in Bears Ears, they don't just study an individual site, they study how they're all connected. It was, one thing that people may not realize that's very striking is that there were more people living in Southeast Utah 1,500 years ago than there are today. It was much more populated. It was the heart of the Puebloan culture and civilization before they moved south and went to New Mexico. So it's a super, super unique area. And, we can get into all of its uniqueness and why it's so special. And I live down there and I have hiked extensively in the area. And it really is, you can wander around and find cultural sites that aren't even on the map. Most of them are not on the map, in fact. But Bears Ears was different both in how the proposal came about, and it's different in what the proposal is meant to protect. And I think Grand Staircase, there are great arguments to be made for that monument being the size that it was designated as. But I think that the arguments in some cases for Bears Ears are even stronger.
Kate Groetzinger, she's with the Center for Western Priorities. It's a public land advocacy group. She also co-hosts the podcast called The Landscape. We'll take another break. Come back in a moment. You're listening to Radio West. This is Radio West. I'm Doug Fabrizio. Last month, President Trump once again redrew the boundaries of two national monuments in Utah, Bears Ears and Grand Staircase-Escalante. The president said cutting them by around 90% was desperately needed. And he was making a broader argument about the Antiquities Act, that it's been misused by other presidents to set aside millions of acres of public land. So we're talking about what the law was actually meant to do. And if Congress can give a president the power to create a national monument, did it also give a president the power to shrink one? Let's get back to our conversation with Kate Groetzinger of the advocacy group, the Center for Western Priorities. Of course, President Trump reduces Bears Ears and Grand Staircase during his first term. President Biden restores them. Trump is in office again. He's reduced them again. Mm-hmm. But in 2017, Trump cut the Grand Staircase by half of what Clinton had designated. Mm-hmm. He cut Bears Ears by more than 80% of what President Obama had set aside.
Yeah.
And now he's cut a lot more than that. How do you understand why he's cut so much more?
Yeah, this is such a great question. It's a question that everyone in my world has been asking each other, and no one has a good answer. Really, the best answer that I've heard was from one of the foremost scholars on public lands in the country, Professor John Leshy. I asked him this just last week, and he said, it's just vindictive. It's just classic Trump one-upsmanship. He was spited by Biden in the restoration of these monuments, and Biden, I should mention, sort of restored them roughly to their original sizes. Yeah. And this is really just his way of saying, screw you. You think you can undo my action? Take this. I initially, when I heard it, thought that it was really setting up the Supreme Court case to argue the smallest size compatible question again, in that in order to prove that these monuments were too big, they needed to make them really small because that's what they want the courts to sort of say. So that's sort of, that's not super clear, but that's sort of the question I was posing to attorneys, and they were sort of like, yeah, it could be that, but it's probably just Trump being petty.
As far as you can tell, how much does Donald Trump really actually consider or think about the Antiquities Act? Not to mention the ongoing public land squabbles going on in Utah, because clearly he's – I shouldn't say clearly, but it seems objectively fair to say clearly he's not writing this stuff for himself.
Yeah.
So who is? Who's writing this proclamation? Who's informing him about all of this? Because it raises the question of whether or not this is driven by industry and the need for energy, national security and minerals like uranium, or in fact if it's just vindictiveness and ideology that's driving all of this.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack in that question, and I'll do it as efficiently as possible. So he's not writing these proclamations himself. I don't think he cares about public lands in Utah. I don't think he's like interested in coming out and visiting these places and understanding them. I don't think he's done that since, his first term. And in the signing ceremony where he signed these proclamations, shrinking the monuments, re-shrinking them, I should say, Utah's delegation was standing behind him. Even I believe our state house leader was there, which is like really clearly showing that this is coming from the state itself. And, one thing that I think will kind of go down in history as the other side of the Bill Clinton signing the Grand Staircase Proclamation at the Grand Canyon coin is Trump misspeaking during that signing ceremony and saying you can't even hunt or fish or hike in these monuments. You can barely even walk on them. Yeah. And Utah's delegation stood by nodding. They know that that's not true. And Kate McGregor, the Deputy Interior Secretary who we spoke about earlier, she said, that's right. That's exactly right, sir. That's why you're fixing that. Yeah. So she also ostensibly should know that that's not true. There is hunting and fishing allowed in both of these monuments. And it, in fact, is controlled by the state, not the federal government. So it's so clear that he's getting his instructions directly from the state. This is not his idea. To the question of who's writing these, we have an office in Utah called the Public Lands Policy Coordinating Office, otherwise known as PLPCO, and they are the ones who came up with and brought that lawsuit claiming, that Utah should get all of the federal land, quote unquote, back. Of course, it was never state land to begin with, which I won't bore you with those details. But this is the same office that filed that Supreme Court petition asking the court to give all of the federal land in Utah to the state. And they are the ones who largely drafted these proclamations. We actually got our hands on some documents, some emails between PLPCO and the federal government, the Interior Department, discussing the reductions. So we know that they were in contact. And when you read the reductions, there are references to things like cultural grazing practices, and they're referring to Mormon grazing practices. Yeah. And that's just sort of very odd language that would kind of only come out of Utah.
Let's get to the question sort of at the center of the debate now, and that is whether or not presidents – it's not whether a president can create a monument.
Yeah.
The question is whether they can undo them, whether they can shrink them. We've talked about how courts have upheld other large monument designations like the Grand Canyon, like Grand Staircase. But this is a very different legal and political atmosphere. There's a different federal court, certainly a very different Supreme Court. So how are you thinking about all of that? Like that there's a precedent, right? There's a precedent. We talked earlier. There's a precedent from the 1920s where the Supreme Court ruled against this minor that the president does have a right to establish, a monument as big as 800,000, maybe larger acres. But can that hold? Will that hold in the current environment?
Yeah, it's a question that no one knows the answer to. But I will say, just to sort of go straight to the point, these reductions will be litigated. The original lawsuits that were filed over the first Trump reductions are actually still active. They were just sort of put on standby. So that case could be revived, or the coalition of conservation groups and tribes could file a new case, but it will be litigated, and it will likely go up to the level of the Supreme Court. The question of whether the Supreme Court will take this case is a big one. Yeah. And the legal scholars I've talked to don't think that the Supreme Court is especially eager to pick this up. It could really unleash sort of regulatory chaos. You know, all of the monuments designated by presidents since the Antiquities Act passed could be litigated, which would be really crazy. You know, if it just kind of could be opening Pandora's box in a way that the court may not want to do. And again, they would have to go against a standing Supreme Court precedent.
So let me ask you, I guess finally, what you think the larger meaning of this fight is. What does this tell us about public lands in Utah, I guess? I mean, you've talked about how the conflict in some ways is more about the monuments themselves, more than just that. It's this long-running struggle over, I guess, control of public land? Like,
yes.
What is it about?
Yeah, it's about control. I mean, it's about who gets to say what happens on these lands. One thing that's worth mentioning is there really aren't significant energy deposits in either of these monuments. Yeah. There's the coal and the Kuiperowitz, but it's no longer financially sort of feasible to mine that coal. The federal government itself has said that. And there are some uranium deposits within Bears Ears. There are tons of claims on uranium in the monument that are grandfathered in. So it's the monument designation itself is not blocking uranium production in Bears Ears, and the market for uranium is currently not such that a new mine could be built it's not financially feasible to build a new uranium mine right now.
And you're arguing the value isn't with that stuff anyway. It's recreation, it's habitat, it's cultural, sites and significance.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you were to make an economic argument for these monuments, they're worth more as protected monuments than they are unprotected to the state. Like, the recreation economy is growing much faster than the coal economy or the uranium economy in southern Utah. The economic argument against these monuments does not stand. So that leaves us with cultural argument, and it's a culture war argument, really. As someone who lived in rural southern Utah and has talked to folks down there is just a sort of cultural disdain for the federal government and its control over these public lands that surround a lot of these small rural communities in southern Utah. And they have this idea that they would be more economically prosperous if that land could be sold off, developed. And there really is just this desire to develop more of southern Utah. And that means, suburbs, resorts, timeshare communities. Like I really deeply believe that that's what Mike Lee would like to see. There is really a desire by a number of folks in power in Utah to sell these lands off so they can be developed. And of course, that is not supported by the American people. We saw last summer Mike Lee tried to sell off public lands by slipping a provision into a must-pass budget bill. And he got completely lit up on the internet by right-wing influencers for doing this. Like it's not just a lefty issue. Everyone wants to keep public lands public, except for Utah's delegation. It's not a winning issue for Utah. The majority of Americans and the majority of Utahns want to see public lands stay public. And we know from polling, the majority of Utahns want to see these national monuments stay protected. And that's what's so sticky about this whole thing. When you get down to the why of it all, like why shrink these monuments, there's not a great answer.
Kate Groetzinger, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Kate Groetzinger, she's with the Center for Western Priorities. It's a public land advocacy group. They're based in Denver. You can subscribe to our show wherever you get your podcasts. We're on Instagram at RadioWest. We're on YouTube at KUER 90.1. You can email us at radiowest@kuer.org. Our intern is Aidan Oneida. The program is produced by Tim Slover. And for the last 15 years, the show was produced by Benjamin Bombard. But this is Ben's last day. And if you think working on a deadline is intense, you should try fighting fires, which is what Ben is doing in this new chapter of his life. And if you know him, it makes complete sense. He's a talented journalist, a great colleague. He's open-hearted, a free spirit, always looking to get outside his comfort zone, and we are going to miss him. Radio West is a production of KUER. I'm Doug Fabrizio.